Hi, thanks for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell. Today I'm going to talk about the dialogue Epinomis. It's not a very well-known dialogue, and there's actually some debate around it of whether or not it's even one of Plato's. It was very common in his day, as I understand, for students to put their teacher's name on their dialogues. It wasn't considered plagiarism, it was considered a compliment. And so there are a lot of spurious dialogues accredited to various teachers, and this is one that perhaps was credited to Plato but was not written by him. Now, the reason I want to cover this dialogue in part is because a lot of people who read Plato in the spiritual way that I read it want to believe that this is Plato. They want to hold on to this one because there's some good stuff in it that is very much consistent with our way of reading Plato. But scholars will outright reject it. I might take the unusual position perhaps of being a spiritual person who agrees on this case with the scholars. I don't think this was actually Plato. As we go on, I will explain why. Now, the name of the dialogue, Epinomis, actually means after the laws. Epi is in like epilogue, after, and nomis is laws. So this was intended to be after the laws. I decided to do it before because, well, I think to end the whole series with a spurious dialogue, or one that I think is spurious, is anticlimactic, so I didn't want to do that. And we can use it instead as sort of an introduction to the laws because many of the themes of the laws are also here as well. But as we go on, I will explain why I do not ultimately think this was Plato. Still, it was probably written by one of his students, and there's quite a bit here that is consistent with Plato, and it's still worth reading, I think. Okay, so it starts off, by the way, the translator I'm using is Alfred Edward Taylor. It starts off with the same characters as the laws, and Clinias was one of the speakers there, and he asks, what are the studies which will lead a mortal man to wisdom? This is our basic theme for this whole dialogue. And the main speaker of the laws is this Athenian stranger. We're going to see that he's also the main speaker here as well. And he says that my thesis is that attainment of bliss and felicity is impossible for mankind, with the exception of a chosen few. So a very strong statement, and the rest of the dialogue is basically his roundabout way of making his case. Now, by the way, one thing that I used to point out quite often in the early dialogues, and I stopped because I just got tired of saying it, was that at this time period, they always talk about mankind, or they use male pronouns. And of course, everything they're saying here applies to women as well. So it's not politically correct, but please don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's a lot of good stuff here. So I just want to throw out that little caveat there. Keep that in mind. There are many people watching videos now who maybe haven't seen the early ones, so I should probably say that again. All right, so now he's going to go on to make his case, and he starts by saying that the soul has a confident trust, a prophetic divination, that she possesses such a native capacity, though what it is, when come by, or how, she can hardly discover. So we have some intuitive sense that wisdom is a thing, but we don't quite know what it is or how to get it. And then we have different ideas of who are the wise people among us. Some people look to prophets or to interpreters of the divine. He says the art of the prophet and his interpreter, again, fails us entirely. He knows only what his oracle says. Whether it is true is more than he can tell. So there's an idea consistent with Plato. And then another possibility, we still have one claimant left to the title of wisdom, a curious capacity which would commonly be spoken of rather as native endowment than as wisdom. That's seen in the person who learns whatever he studies with facility, has a capacious and trustworthy memory, recalls the relevant and appropriate steps in every situation, and does so without delay. So a person who acts in a certain way might be seen as wise, or a person with a high IQ. But he's saying even that is not the measure of wisdom. So how can we but believe that the cause of all the blessings we enjoy is likewise the cause of that which is far the greatest of all, understanding? And so now he's going to take it in another direction. The gift of the whole number series, he says, so we shall assume he gives us likewise the rest of understanding and all other good things. But this is the greatest boon of all. if a person will accept this gift of number and let his mind expatiate over the whole heavenly circuit. So here we have the idea of pure number as the doorway into the divine, and we're going to see this theme running throughout. So whoever wrote this, whether it was Plato or one of his students or someone else, it was someone who was familiar with the Timaeus, if it wasn't Plato himself who wrote this, where he presents number as a doorway into the divine, or it was written by somebody who was perhaps a student at the academy, or a student who had studied, say, Pythagoras or other philosophers who influenced Plato as well, who introduced the idea of numbers as something pure and divine. Without true discourse, a man will never become wise, and if he has not wisdom, the chiefest constituent of full virtue, he can never become perfectly good, and therefore not happy. So ties in the idea of happiness and wisdom. This is very much consistent with Plato. Up to now, this dialogue very well could have been written by Plato. It's very much consistent with everything that he taught, and we're going to see this theme also running throughout the laws. As for the right, the good, the noble, and the like, no man who has given his adherence to a true belief, but without knowledge, will ever enumerate them in a way to bring conviction to himself and to others. Again, another common theme in Plato. We see this, for example, in the Meno, where Plato shows that true belief is not enough. It'll help you in some cases, but the problem with beliefs is that you have to nail them down with understanding and then with the experience of knowledge. I fancy it was for some greater purpose that when God had made the moon in the sky, waxing and waning, as we have said, he combined the months into a year, and so all the creatures, by a happy providence, began to have a general insight into the relations of number with number. Again, I think that whoever wrote this was very much influenced by the Timaeus, even though it's called after the laws. There's quite a bit here about the Timaeus. This idea was also there as well. The idea that the greatest thing about astronomy is that it brings us into the questioning of philosophy and into numbers in that pure sense. I argue there are gods, that their care extends to all things, great or small, and that no entreaties can win them to depart from the path of justice. This is a whole book of the laws right here. And I think that this statement alone is probably one of the reasons why people drawn to the spiritual aspects of Plato really want to believe that the Epinomis is Plato. He says, the chief point of all was this, that soul, all soul, is older than body, all body. Absolutely consistent with Plato, no question. As for that which holds its course uniformly through the sky, we should count this abundant proof of its intelligence in the unbroken regularity, excuse me, you see my voice? Sorry about that. In the unbroken regularity and uniformity of its path, and of all it does and has done to it, it provides convincing evidence of intelligent life. So whereas we tend to think that the uniformity of the stars is proof that there's no intelligence there, he's saying it's actually proof that there is, and that's going to come up again. For mankind, it should have been proof that the stars in their whole procession have intelligence, that they act with unbroken uniformity, because their action carries out a plan resolved on from untold ages. They do not change their purpose confusedly, acting now thus and again thus, and wandering from one orbit to another. Yet most of us have imagined the very opposite. Because they act with uniformity and regularity, we fancy them to have no souls. Hence the mass has followed the leading of fools. It imagines that humans are intelligent and alive because we're so mutable, but deity, because it keeps to the same orbits, is unintelligent. And one more. Yet man might have chosen the fairer, better, more welcome interpretation. He might have understood that which eternally does the same acts in uniform way and for the same reasons is for that very reason to be deemed intelligent, and that this is the case with the stars. So very interesting argument, the idea that our lack of uniformity is proof that we are not necessarily wise, that we're torn in one direction and then in others. So we are split, we're in factions. We don't have that uniform, or at least unless, except for the person, of course, who has reached that pinnacle of wisdom. But most of us do not act with that kind of uniformity that would be the mark of wisdom. Okay, now we're going to get into why I start to have some doubts that this is Plato, because everything up to now, it very well could have been Plato. We maintain first that there are two sorts of being, soul being one and body the other, that there are many of either kind, all different from one another, and either sort from the other, that there is no tertium quid or third something common to both, that soul is more excellent than body. Up to now, could be consistent with Plato. He doesn't have only two sorts of being. Plato also talks about the intelligible beyond the soul, but perhaps he's talking about in our physical world, so we can try to save it up to this point. So, okay, there's soul and there's body, and soul is more excellent than body. And soul we shall, of course, take to be intelligent, body is unintelligent. Soul is sovereign, body is the subject. Up to now, okay, it could be Plato, but then this next line, he says that soul is the universal cause, whereas body is a cause of no effect whatsoever. Plato does not call soul a universal cause, the universal cause. He does have an intelligible beyond soul. And so this is what causes me to start to think that maybe this is not Plato. And we'll see even more as we go on. He says, in the happy person, this order, he's talking about that order of the soul that brings that unity that I was talking about before. And for the happy person, this order awakens first wonder, and then the passion to learn all of it that mortality may. For 'tis thus, as he believes, he will spend his days best and with most good fortune, and after his decease reach the proper abodes of virtue, as he has been initiated into the true and real mysteries by receiving wisdom in her unity, in a mind which is itself a unity. He will henceforth have face-to-face fruition of the most glorious of realities, so far as his vision can reach. So this, I think, a very beautiful passage here, the idea of wisdom in her unity, being received by a mind, which is itself a unity. Very nice imagery there, very much consistent with Plato here. The idea that happiness and virtue are tied together. So this is that theme, the idea of why he thinks very few people will know true happiness. We're getting a hint of it here. This is something that is quite consistent with the way Plato has treated virtue, and we'll see this. We've seen it throughout his dialogues. I've talked about it in many other videos. We'll see it in the laws as well. So a very nice image of that experience of beauty itself. There is one fear that no Greek should harbor, the fear that 'tis a forbidden thing for mortality to concern itself with the study of divinity. No, we should believe the clean contrary, that deity is neither unintelligent nor ignorant of human nature, but knows that, with itself for teacher, we will follow where we are led and learn the lessons that we are taught. So nice imagery there, the idea of deity to humans as like a teacher to students. Again, very much consistent with Plato, the idea that we should not fear this kind of study. We should welcome it. This is our birthright. Some people say that you shouldn't question some things. They're afraid to look, and they're afraid of maybe evil lurking in the unknown. But for a Platonist, this is not a concern at all. And deity is, of course, aware that this lesson of number and counting is the very thing that it teaches and we learn. And so again, going back to the idea of pure number, deity, unaware of this, would be the most unintelligent of things. The proverb about not knowing one's own identity, know thyself, in other words, it would be true of it to the letter if it felt wrath against the capable learner, and not rather a joy pure of all envy at seeing him growing in goodness by God's aid. And thus, as we hold that soul is the universal cause, and that since the cause of good is always of the same nature as itself, and that of evil, again, always of its nature, 'Tis only natural that soul should be universally the cause of revolution and movement, the best soul causing motion and revolution in the direction of good, and the other sort of soul that in the opposite direction. Good must be and ever has been triumphant over its contrary. This is this passage where I really have to conclude that this cannot be Plato, even though this writer clearly has studied Plato, perhaps even studied with him personally. Ultimately, I just don't think this is consistent with Plato. So I've already talked about this idea of soul not being the universal cause. That is not at all consistent with Plato. He does have an intelligible beyond the soul, and then of course there's the transcendent first cause beyond all being. So this is not consistent. And then another problem, just as grave, is this one, the idea of evil having its own nature. This is not consistent with Plato. This is something that Socrates actually argued against in the dialogue Republic, where his interlocutors were suggesting that there is such a thing as evil, and he had to show, this was in there, they presented two hypothetical people, one who is a person who is truly good but is seen as unjust and is treated badly in society, another person who is truly unjust but is seen as just and so has all the rewards and benefits of being seen as a just person. And the question was, why would anybody want to be the just person? People just want the image of justice. And so show that justice itself, that truly having justice is important even if you don't get the benefit of the image. And so the whole dialogue is about Socrates showing what justice is. And in the presentation of these two hypotheticals, this idea is thrown out that evil has its own nature. And so it's one of the things that Socrates had to knock down in his presentation of what justice really is. This is not consistent with the way Platonists deal with evil or badness. It's just ignorance. There's ignorance in the soul, and people can act in horrible ways, do things that we can define as evil, the way we hurt one another, but the root of it all is always ignorance. And so this idea of evil having its own nature is not consistent with Plato. Perhaps what this person had in mind, because this person seems to have been quite influenced by the dialogue Timaeus, maybe the idea of the circle of the same and the circle of the different, they turn in opposite directions. But the circle of the different is not evil, it is simply functioning at a lower power, and so ignorance can work its way in. So this is into the progression of reality. So this is not consistent with Plato, and so coming to this, I just have to conclude that this was very likely not written by Plato. But whoever did write this dialogue, again, very likely is very familiar with Plato's teachings and has been highly influenced, and there's quite a bit in here that I do like and do agree with. So it's still worth reading. Now this person, is this Athenian stranger, is going to give us a definition or a description of the person who is the most nobly endowed, the person who is born with the right personality, if you will, the right traits and qualities. So it's a person who has an easy grace, who has a slow and sure way of going about things, doesn't rush things, is not impatient, slow and steady wins the race, that kind of personality. A person who is also courageous or has valor, sobriety of life, a calm person, not somebody chasing experiences, and a person who's more stable and has a sober kind of life. And then he says if you combine that personality with a capacity to learn and a retentive memory, then you have the kind of person who would take such delight in all that will prove a lover of learning. So you take that nature and then you have to combine it with the right nurture. He says, though it is hard for such characters to make their appearance, when they do appear and get the nurture and education they require, they will be able to keep the more numerous and worser sort in all due subjection, ordering all their relations with the gods and all matters of sacrifices and purity toward God and man rightly and reasonably, in thought, word, and deed. Men will thus be no formal hypocrites, but true worshippers of virtue. And this, of course, is the point of chief concern for the whole community. So you have to bring together that nature and nurture in such a person then will bring order to their own soul and be like the philosopher king of their soul, as we saw in the Republic. And then also that person, he says, if that person is a leader of a community, then we'll be able to run that community in a smooth, wise way. All right, we must do what we can to enumerate the subjects to be studied. So now we know the person that we're looking for. What kind of studies then would be the proper nurture? And this is, again, we're going to get into the idea of pure number. We want to explain their nature and the methods to be employed, to say, in fact, how a person should learn piety and in what it consists. So here are the studies. It may seem odd to the ear, but the name we give to the study is one which will surprise a person unfamiliar with the subject: astronomy. Are you aware that the true astronomer must be a person of great wisdom? I do not mean an astronomer of the type of Hesiod and his like, a man who has just observed settings and risings, but one who has studied 7 out of the 8 orbits, as each of them completes its circuit in a fashion not easy of comprehension by any capacity, not endowed with admirable abilities. So what we saw in the Republic, for example, is Socrates took various studies in the natural sciences and mathematics that are used in practical sense, and he gave them metaphysical correlates. And he talked about them in a very different way. And we're going to see that the Athenian stranger here is doing the same thing. Hence, there will be a need for several sciences. The first and most important of them is likewise that which treats of pure numbers. Not numbers concreted in bodies, but the whole generation of the series of odd and even, and the effects which it combines to the nature of things. So not numbers as we use them in the physical world, not things that you count, but numbers in that pure sense, that whole generation of the series of odd and even. So he's talking about numbers in themselves. When all this has been mastered, next in order comes what is called by the very ludicrous name mensuration, or the study of measurement. But it's really a manifest assimilation to one another of numbers which are naturally dissimilar, affected by reference to areas. Now, to a person who can comprehend this, it will be plain that this is no mere feat of human skill, but a miracle of God's contrivance. So he's raising the idea of measurement. This line here, assimilation to one another of numbers which are naturally dissimilar. In the Timaeus, for example, soul is formed by the combining of the similar and the dissimilar. So he's talking about creation itself, and that's why it's a miracle of God's contrivance. Next, numbers raised to the third power, and thus presenting an analogy with three-dimensional things coming into our physical world. Here again, he assimilates the dissimilar by a second science, which those who hit on the discovery have named stereometry, or the gauging of solids, according to the translator. It's a device of God's contriving which breeds amazement in those who fix their gaze on it and consider how universal nature molds form and type by the constant revolution of potency in its converse about the double in the various progressions. So creation itself, how our physical world came to be. The first example of this ratio of the double in the advancing number series is that of 1 to 2. Double of this is the ratio of their second powers, 1 to 4. And double of this again, the advance to the solid and tangible as we proceed from 1 to 8. And so we see that he's raising the powers of 2. And the advance to a mean of the double, that mean which is equidistant from lesser and greater terms, talking there about the arithmetic mean, or the other mean which exceeds the one term and is itself exceeded by the other by the same fraction of the respective terms. That's the definition of the harmonic mean. Why, in the potency of the mean between these terms and its double sense, with its double sense, we have a gift from the blessed choir of the Muses, to which mankind owes the boon of the play of connaissance and measure, with all they contribute to rhythm and melody. So for those of you not drawn to the mathematical side of Platonism, this is a very confusing passage. But basically what he's bringing in here is the arithmetic mean and the harmonic mean. These are talked about in various places. Again, I'll refer to the Timaeus because I think this writer was very much influenced by the Timaeus. These two means are defined there, and I did talk about them in one of my videos on the Timaeus. So Plato is talking in that dialogue about analogy being part of the very fabric of the unfolding of reality. It's the language in part of the logos itself. And so mean analogies are not just a tool that humans use to try to understand things. It's actually built into the very unfolding of reality. We must also grasp the accuracy of the periodic times and the precision with which they complete the various celestial motions. And this is where a believer in our doctrine that soul is both older and more divine than body will appreciate the beauty and justice of the saying that all things are full of gods, and that we have never been left unheeded by the forgetfulness and carelessness of the higher powers. So the idea of providence running through all, God's running through all, very much consistent with Plato, although he doesn't necessarily state it as directly. And I think this kind of passage is why those drawn to the spiritual side of Platonism very much want to believe that the Epinomis was written by Plato. To the person who pursues his studies in the proper way, all geometric constructions, all systems of numbers, all duly constituted melodic progressions, the single ordered scheme of all celestial revolutions should disclose themselves, and disclose themselves they will, if, as I say, a person pursues his studies aright, with his mind's eye fixed on their single end, so looking to the divine itself. As such a person reflects, he will receive the revelation of a single bond of natural interconnection between all these problems. So these various studies on the surface seem unrelated. Studying these various mathematical sciences, astronomy, bringing in music, melodic progressions here. So all these studies seem unrelated if you look at them in our physical world, but when you see their metaphysical correlates, you see how they're all tied together because they're all focusing us on that single end, the divine itself. Him who has mastered all these lessons I account in truth as wisest. Of him I dare affirm, 'tis a fancy, and yet I am in earnest with it too, that such a person, when death has put the end to his allotted term, if he may be said still to endure beyond death, will no longer be subject, as he is now, to a multitude of perceptions. He will have but one allotted portion, even as he has reduced the manifold within himself to unity, and in it will be happy, wise, blessed, all in one. Again, tying together the idea of virtue and happiness. And it's a theme, by the way, that we will see throughout the laws as well. Thus we're brought back once more to the same very truth with which we began. Rightly did we say that perfect bliss and happiness are impossible for all men save a few. 'Tis only they who are at once of godlike parts, sober of soul, endowed by nature with all other virtue, and have moreover mastered the whole contents of the blissful science. What that is we have explained. 'Tis they, and they only, who have received in full possession all that deity have to give. So there he brought together his initial claim that very few people will know happiness. He took a rather roundabout way to make his case that it has to do with virtue. Very few people will develop virtue in the way that Plato taught it, the way that Socrates taught it, and those are the few who can know happiness. So I think it is a good dialogue, one worth reading. Again, I don't think it was ultimately written by Plato, but whoever wrote it clearly was familiar with Plato, although there are those two places that I mentioned earlier that I think this writer got it wrong. Still a dialogue worth reading, and we can see that as maybe an introduction to bring us into the laws, because these themes here are going to run throughout the laws as well. And I'm going to start that series of dialogue or of videos from next week, and I do hope you will join me. As always, if you like what you saw, I do hope you'll hit the like button. Also, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. And thank you very much. I do hope you'll join me next week.